Walraversijde is an abandoned medieval fishing village on the Belgian coast near Ostend. It was rediscovered in 1992 in a dune area near a medieval dike. Archaeological research showed that it had been occupied in two phases, between 1200 and 1600. Walraversijde has been studied more thoroughly and more systematically than any other medieval fishing community in Europe. The village has been partially reconstructed, and has a museum, Walraversijde Museum, dedicated to the site. Discovery. Walraversijde was discovered in 1992 on the Belgian coast by the archaeologist Marnix Peters. It was found in a dune area near a medieval dike. Prior to discovery, Walraversijde was a lost village with no obvious remains above ground. Two related sites were excavated, one on a beach and the other on a polder. The beach site was inhabited between 1200 and 1400, and the polder site was inhabited between 1400 and 1600. The excavations also found evidence of activities during the Roman era, such as the Roman dike. Walraversijde ceased having a role after the siege of Ostend of 1601 to 1604, when a Spanish cavalry camp operated from the site. The artifacts and remains are well preserved, and there have been many finds. The sites have been excavated systematically and thoroughly, and have produced unusually rich findings. Early village. The village of the earlier beach phase of Walraversijde was located behind a protective dune belt. The houses were arranged in small, loose groups, the largest house measuring 7 by 12 meters. Written sources indicate the villagers fished, traded salted fish and other goods, and sometimes engaged in piracy. They probably also dug peat to produce salt. However, the dune belt was maintained badly and Walraversijde became vulnerable. In 1394, a flood drowned the town of Ostend and caused heavy sand drifts and floods around the village. Walraversijde ended up in front of the dunes, and had to be rebuilt further inland. Later village. The new Walraversijde was relocated on a polder protected by a new dike. At least 100 houses were built, with widths between 3.7 and 8.8 meters and lengths between 12.4 and 17.5 meters. They were built mainly using brick, are often plastered inside and outside. Some houses had stained windows. Floors were brick or sand-covered clay, and roofs were thatched with reeds, straw, galangale. There were also community spaces, such as a drapeletsen for making cordage, a brewery and a kayetspool. Around 1435 a chapel was built, as might be expected for a settlement preoccupied with the sea. The occupation density was much higher than in non-fishing rural communities. No spaces were set aside for stables, gardens or fields between houses. Between 1383 and 1413, under the supervision of the admirals of the Count of Flanders and the Duke of Burgundy, privateering and piracy took place between English and Flemish fishing and trading vessels. The fishermen of Walraversijde participated in this privateering to the degree that they were warned not to plunder or damage ships at sea unless ordered to do so by the Duke. In addition to acting as privateers under the orders of the Duke, Walraversijde fishermen supplied the Duke's fleet with vessels and the fishing fleet with guard boats throughout the 15th century. The villages had commodities one might not expect to find in a medieval fishing community. There were exotic spices such as paradise grains, cloves and pepper, exotic fruit such as pomegranates, ivory combs, cast bronze candlesticks and luxury ceramics. The piracy, privateering and also beachcombing must have played a part in this, as probably also did the piloting of Spanish merchant vessels vessels by Walraversijde fishermen to the port of Bruges. By the middle of the 15th century, Walraversijde reached its heyday, becoming, both economically and politically, the most important village in the region. It was well populated, housing perhaps 500 to 600 people, though half the population were usually away at sea. The village operated about 20 fishing vessels, each crewed with between 13 and 20 fishermen. The fishermen were individually free and independent, brought their own nets, and shared in the profits. The Cypriots owned the fishing vessels, and were the central figures in the village at the top of the social hierarchy. Later in the 15th century, larger vessels were developed which could sail to the lucrative offshore fishing grounds of the Dogger Bank. Purchasing these vessels required money which the fishermen did not have. Rich fish merchants invested in the fleet, and the new ship owners' awards took control of the offshore fishing. The role of the captains diminished and the independent fishermen were reduced to wage fishermen. Restorations and artifacts. Decline. Towards the end of the 15th century, the region became politically unstable. Starting in 1483, Maximilian of Austria warred against a coalition of Bruges and Ghent for 10 years. Walraversijde was in the middle of these battles and was probably deserted during this time. The houses in the eastern quarter of the village were ruined and subsequently abandoned. To make matters worse, the fishing fleet became endangered at sea. Different parties in the English Channel and the North Sea became threatening in various ways, and the fishermen had to arrange for armed ships to protect the fleet. Meanwhile, the sand dunes started drifting again, and the village buoy closed. But this was just a start. In 1568, the 80 Years' War began. The sea beggars blockaded coastal ports while mercenaries plundered and looted the coast itself. In 1571, the dikes that surrounded Ostend were breached in a desperate attempt to defend the town. For 11 further years, the region, including Walraversijde, was flooded and uninhabitable. Beyond this, the war still carried on, further destroying the area. By 1598, written sources recount how wasted the area had become, including Walraversijde. The finishing touch was the siege of Ostend, after which, apart from some isolated houses, the fishing community of Walraversijde ceased to exist. The tower of the chapel remained until the 19th century, when it collapsed in a storm. Walraversijde Museum. Because of the archaeological richness of the findings, the province of West Flanders decided to present the results in an on-site interactive museum, Walraversijde Museum. The museum opened in 2000, and includes 3 medieval houses and a bakery, smokehouse. These late medieval buildings have been reconstructed as they are thought to have appeared during the prime of Walraversijde around 1465. Together with furniture, fittings and fixtures, Flemish artists were particularly productive during the 15th century, and the paintings have been helpful guides during reconstruction. The museum displays artifacts which give a sense of the medieval fishing industry and trade, as well as the risks the fishermen faced at sea, such as piracy, war and shipwrecks. There are further displays concerning household goods, clothing, hygiene, religious and recreational life, mouth bows and staffs, toys for young and old, including a well-engineered pair of bone glasses. Walraversijde has been studied more thoroughly and systematically than any other medieval fisherman community in Europe. This is in part because most other locations are still inhabited. Other images